You are listening to Revenue Insights. Today, I'm joined by John Hammond. He's the Fractional Chief Revenue Officer who's currently working with Duel Tech and Routefusion. John's career has spanned SaaS and technology-focused businesses, and he's specialized in how to help startups to scale their go-to-market strategy. John, pleasure.
Good to be here.
I guess for the reference of anyone listening to this is our second attempt at trying to record this. Having had such a great conversation the first time, I failed to hit the record button. So I'm hoping, John, that we're going to pull up a lot of those nuggets that we talked about before. But that being said, for anyone that perhaps hasn't come across you previously, what is your story?
So I'm 52, so I've been around a while, right? So I'm a dinosaur in tech terms.
I usually like to introduce people with, they've got this many decades worth of experience. So I've saved you that one at least.
Yeah, 3 decades, right? And I started at a time when e-business didn't even exist, right? And the only internet browser you had was whatever was on the computer. You didn't really know. And your search engine was Alta Vista, right? So that's how old I am, right? And so started off leaving university, sort of falling into a role in IBM and spending a few years there, doing all that kind of incredible training, which we'll talk a bit about later. And then I went off and did sort of traditional IBM channel, selling hardware and then software and then managed services back in the days when we called outsourcing managed services and all that kind of stuff. And then I sort of, the second third of my career, if you like, was I came across a company called Rackspace where I was involved and ran their cloud business. And then it kind of opened up my mind to a very different world, different technological advancement, a kind of change in the industry. And I've been working with kind of SaaS companies since then because we don't call it cloud anymore. I'm old enough to call it cloud still. And so I've been working there. And then I started getting more interested in what people were doing on top of what is now known as infrastructure as a service, what we call cloud then. And so that's been the kind of journey, if you like. And I went from being a quota-carrying sales rep, and I've been a marketing manager, marketing director, an ops director. I ran a professional services team. I was a commercial director. I was involved in a couple of mergers and acquisitions. I've been involved in raising money. But the last 10 years has been pretty much chief revenue officer for scale-up SaaS-style businesses. I've done a couple of fintechs, a couple of non-fintechs. So I've been helping businesses grow their business. Once they've got past the kind of product market fit, then that's a really good time to hire someone like me. And now what I'm doing is advising businesses on how to do that.
Amazing. And I suppose how I want to begin, so I think we first crossed paths, John. I think I was listening to another podcast that you were talking on, and I heard you referencing some EBSA data in there, which got me really interested to dig a little bit further into, I guess, what's most of interest and how you're using it as well. And I think we'll get into a bit more detail around that. I probably want to begin with our latest analysis for everyone listening came out a couple of weeks before we recorded this. And I guess the beauty of that is it kind of provides an overview of the market. And probably the 3 kind of standout trends that we saw were 69% of reps missing quota, some 44% of deals slipping, and an 8.9x velocity delta between top and average performing reps. And so I guess where I'd like to begin is, how does that compare with your experience? I know that you're actively working with a number of startup to scale up companies at the minute. So I'm just intrigued like how that compares with your experience.
It is entirely consistent with my experience at present.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that 3 years ago, but it is entirely consistent with my experience. And I think the way that you kind of explain it, the way you lay it out is, here's what we see, here's what top performers look like. And that distinction between top performers' behavior and let's call them average performers' behavior is enormous, right? And I think that's the distinction that I'm also seeing. You know, a great salesperson performs their role in a particular way. They've got certain habits and certain activities and style, and not a style. No, I'm not talking about style as in like, you know, how they, you know, but they have a mechanism by which they do it, and it is consistent. And whether they know about MedPick, or as I would use Medic, or not, they are doing those things. That's what is natural to them. Okay. Or they've been taught it somewhere. And that's why that it's entirely consistent. But I'm also seeing that huge discrepancy between top and average performers.
I think of a lot of the folks that I'll bring on, that would be a similar kind of story, particularly in terms of the number of reps kind of falling short at the minute and that gap between the two. And so let's dig into that a little bit more. What would you say is the most surprising attribute of a top performer?
Well, I'm not surprised. So I'm not going to answer your question, Lee. I'm not surprised by top performers. Yeah. They are so different. But I think the thing that will surprise others, maybe I can answer it that way, is actually they are incredibly professional. So it is this notion that they very rarely have all their deals lined up for the last day of the month, because they know their perspective isn't, I'm going to stick it in the database, in the CRM and put it there because I'll get to it and I'll worry about it. They're thinking about when they're going to close it. They've already thought about that. They've done the work before they create the opportunity, and they think, okay, it's going to close here. And so it's a really simple thing, but it's things like that. They are constantly updating the CRM. And this is the kind of thing that if you speak to an average performer, they'll say, oh, I haven't got time for my admin. Would you rather I sold or updated the CRM? I'm like, well, I don't see how they're different things. Right. And so it's just a general level of professionalism that I think surprises others with high performers. There's this kind of sense that top performers are out there somewhere doing sales in some kind of magical way, and they've got time for the pettiness of updating the CRM and their forecasts and stuff like that. But actually, the top performers, that is part of the rigor. That is part of the professionalism that's required. So that, I haven't answered your question directly, but I think that's the bit that I think often surprises people with great performance.
I'd agree. I mean, I think it's certainly come up a few times in conversations I've had with folks, and there's almost, with top performers, there's almost a degree of Pandora's box there, where it's like, I ask a lot of people, what are your top performers doing? And there's usually a pretty consistent, well, they're self-sourcing pipeline. That comes up quite a bit. But beyond that, and when you start to dig a bit further, it's like, well, I'm not 100% sure. So often I think there's a degree of, or certainly with some top performers, perhaps they're not recording their calls, perhaps they're doing things outside of the system of record, and therefore, but there's also a mentality of, well, if it ain't broken, then I'm not going to fix it. I'm going to focus on everyone else. However, I think to your point, it's interesting, and you touched on MedPick as well. It's a different perspective on what they're doing with that. I think on one hand, it's very often kind of ascribed as, well, it's admin, right? It's admin to go and set a next step. It's admin to fill out a qualification methodology. But when you spin it in a different way, and I think both how you and I would see it, it's not about the admin. It's about why you are doing it. And, that next step shows, I know what now needs to be done. Right. And that, I think, comes from a number of different places, experience being one of them.
Yeah. And so let's take next steps. It's a really good example. Every CRO sales director I've ever met, and me, by the way, loves making that a mandatory field. Right. But here's what I'm after. This is what I think an average performer does. Right. A top performer has discussed the next step with the client in the call. And so therefore, they are recording what that next step is as based on their sales process, our sales process, and the engagement with the customer. An average performer is filling it in as homework. Oh yeah, I've got to put all my next steps in. So they sit down and they write all their next steps in one go. Do you know how I can tell that? They're all date marked, time stamped and date marked. And then that's the difference. It's just that kind of thing. It's the application of it versus the administration of it. And it's that kind of level. And also I found with things like when you implement, and I'm sorry, I'm going to keep using the word medic because that's the word in my head.
By all means.
When you implement medic, there is a real difference with how that is taken by someone who is either a top performer or aspires to be a top performer. Because what they're trying to learn are the techniques that drive out the results, the outcomes that you want to understand the deal, and they don't take it personally. It's an objective activity rather than a subjective review. And so they're trying to learn, like, okay, well, how does that work? What kind of questions would you ask for that? And they're immediately going out and doing it. Whereas what you get with more average performers, that they're less interested because they just think, oh, this is going to make, you can't do this on small deals, right? And it's that kind of like, oh yeah, but my deals are different. You don't understand. And I hate to be, to play the age game, but like, dude, there's really not much I don't understand. It's saying I know everything and I've got nothing to learn, but like I've heard pretty much every excuse before. And that's a red light to me, a red flag, as we would say in modern language. That is not a good thing. And one of the things that I was speaking to someone about the other day, and this is my perception of this, is this kind of notion of when top performers close out a deal, as not close won as in close lost, that's what they are doing it for, right? So this is, back in the day, I had a really brilliant mentor in sales, and he said a really simple thing to me, and it was, that the science of sales is figuring out who the hell you sell to, right? And taking those opportunities forward. The art of sales is getting them to buy, right? And it really stuck with me. And that is this before any real analysis, right? But that is what's happening with top performers. They are closing out opportunities in the discovery phase because they're saying, I'm not going to win this deal, or I don't have a chance of winning this deal. And I'm not talking a 1 in 5 chance or a 1 in 10 chance. They're thinking 1 in 2 and 1 in 3. Ideally 1 in 2. Certainly in new business. 1 in 3 is that kind of lazy 3 times coverage nonsense. I don't buy into that. And that's really important because these people are saying, my time is valuable. And it's the only thing I can't get any more of. And therefore, I'm only going to work on opportunities that give me a return or have a chance to give me a return to the level of risk I'm willing to take on that and with my time. So that's kind of first thing. And that really comes out. That really comes out in the data. The second bit is why. And these 2 things are really interesting. And I guarantee you, an average performer, and you've seen it in the data, their deals slip and slip and slip. And they're losing because of budget, priority, or competition. Now, I'm going to be a bit cruel. I'm going to say these are false objections. Because here's what I know, and Gartner research backs that, which is 50% of deals that are done do not have a budget. They don't have a budget. Because they found the budget because the ROI was compelling enough, right? Or return on capital, whatever measure you use. And then it's the priority. It's not priority right now. And I was talking to a ref about this the other day, and he said, well, whenever I've heard that, I always feel a bit like they're fobbing me off. And I'm not, and you're right, they are. They're fobbing you off.
Yeah.
It's not a priority right now. That's because you haven't done a good enough job telling them or working with them rather than telling them, working with them to just help them understand why this is so important and how it's going to improve their business. Because that's the fundamental bit. Like, how do you improve their business? The final bit is competitors. They were a bit better than you. Like, oh man, like losing to a competitor, that's not okay, mate. And I know that's tough and you will lose to competitors, but very few products are the same. Very few offerings are the same. So therefore, you've not found the right relationship. And if you are similar, really, you've lost to someone who's outsold you. What's really interesting with top performers is what they're closing these deals out super early. And here's their reasons. They haven't got the feature set that delivers what the customer wants. So they've already decided, I can't win this because the thing that they need, I haven't got it. As opposed to, do you think we could do this? Can we hash something together? And in SaaS world, that is death as far as I'm concerned, right? And we'll talk a bit about that in a second. Or the other one is they can't prove out the ROI. And that has 2 sides to it. They can't uncover the bit of ROI from the customer or the prospect that allows them to go figure out, the metric, if you like, in medic terms, to figure out what the ROI is. Or the customer hasn't got a compelling enough case, which means it's going to drift. These are really different reasons. They're fundamentally different reasons, right? And when you look at that spider diagram with the adoption of MedPIC, if you look at the lowest performers, they barely register on economic bias. They barely register on it, right? They don't even know who the hell makes the decision. They barely register on metric. They're nowhere on decision criteria, and they're nowhere on decision process. Look, here's the fundamentals of selling. What's the problem? Identify pain. Really straightforward, right? Who owns this problem? Not who signs the check, because it's always the same person that signs the check, right? Like, who owns this problem? Who owns the economic problem, right? How would you measure whether you've solved the problem? How are you going to make this decision? Everything else is interesting, but if you haven't got that, you can't make a deal, right? And if you do, you are lucky. And trust me, there is nothing wrong with being lucky, right? As every lottery will tell you, right? But the key here is, as sales professionals or as go-to-market professionals, or in the context that I'm talking to you now as a sales professional, this is about winning. And so if you're a professional athlete and you don't train and you don't get your form right in the race or the event or the throwing thing that you're doing or the jumping thing you're doing, if you haven't thought through how you're going to be, what your version of success looks like and what you think your standards are, you can't be successful. Why would that? I mean, that's an extreme end because it's elite. But how would, it's the same thing to me. You're going to use up company resources. You're going to use up your resources in your time. And by the way, at least 50% of your salary is up for grabs, right? Because it's commission based. You're going to put all that at risk and not know these things. Now, if you don't know, and this is the point we've spoken about a couple of times, if you're not trained and you don't know, that's not your fault, right? But if you do get trained and it does get identified to you, that's a whole other issue, right? And I wonder how much of this analysis is down to the fact that people don't know. They're not aware. They haven't been trained. And if I look at the distinction between my experience when I joined IBM, which was weeks and weeks of courses, I think it was over an 18-month period. It's like 12, 15 weeks off-site, right? Plus I had to do 50 practice calls with registered people inside the company who would grade me and give me feedback. And then I had a 2-week assessment center. That's just like some of these people I come across, and they're good people. They're smart. They've got a good degree, or they work hard, or they're trying really hard, but they haven't got the fundamental skills. And this is one of the reasons why over the last few years, I've adopted something like Medic, because it's such a terrific coaching framework. It's about, if you can dissect a deal at that particular stage and say, you are here in order to navigate yourself to the summit. These are the things you have to do. And let's talk about how you're going to do those things. That's incredibly powerful because it starts to fill that gap. But I suspect that low performer number is because everyone's got identified pain, right? Everyone does it. How you do it, that's the difference, right? So you could identify the pain. Oh, yeah. And this was I used to sell a management software, sort of upgrading software for Windows. And I'd go, what's the problem? Oh, they have to upgrade Windows. Trust me, no one wants to upgrade Windows. Like, no one on the planet Earth has ever wanted to upgrade an operating system for their laptop. It's never been a thing. They have to upgrade an operating system for their laptop for another reason. What is it? Oh, it's out of support. Okay, but they could buy Macs. Right? That could solve the problem. They could just buy Macs and it could be different. Like, what is going on in that? So it's trying to understand the difference of quality between just in identified pain, even though there's a correlation between, or a similar execution between low performers and top performers. That's the closest they get. And it is quite close. I think the quality level is fundamentally different.
There's so much that I kind of want to dig into with everything that you just said. And it's probably important for me to note at this stage that a link to everything that John is referring to will be in the show notes below. And probably the second thing that I wanted to call out is I really like your observations on some of the analysis that we did on objection handling. And actually, when creating that report, I was kind of holding myself back from trying to provide a somewhat biased point of view and like my read on the data. So it's very interesting actually hearing your perspective on it, because I mean, I would concur with a similar point of view of when I look at the data looks at the self-reported reasons why a top and an average performer say that they're losing deals. And I saw a very similar thing for those like average performers, it was a similar case of budget, priority, competition, where they're regularly losing. And I guess my point of view was based off the fact that I know that I've used, when being cold called, the objections of, it's not a priority right now. I don't have the budget for it. But as a leader, I'm obviously open to the fact that I know that my priorities can change. If it is a compelling enough case and I can see the potential impact of it, my priorities are pretty malleable. And, budgets, ultimately, if you're talking to the right person, then a senior decision maker, then budget's not a problem. Budget can be shifted around. Budget can be made available. Whilst for competitors, I think, that's one for, I think, marketers to be aware of, but also like sales management as well of, well, have we been trained enough on how we position ourselves against a competitor? Do we understand like how we are different enough against that competitor? And so that was kind of my takeaway from it. Whereas you compare it to those top performers, and probably the only additional layer that I thought when I was producing the report that I think you might agree with, John, would be, I feel like so many of those objections can be certainly anticipated when qualifying. So there's so much alignment. And I think we use both MEDPIC and Spiced in our analysis because they were the two most frequently coming up. Where there was so much alignment based off of, well, if budget's the objection, then have you been able to understand more about what the pain is and, what potential business impact that's going to have on them? If it's
what's the implication of that pain? Can you quantify it? Because if you can, then there's the budget, right?
Exactly, right? And if it's challenges around priority, then it's a similar point, right? Is it going to be a nice to have for them or is it going to be a need to have? And I feel like there's, certainly when creating it, it felt like there was so much alignment just from having that framework to really set up everything that came after it.
Yeah, I mean, just let's take one thing there, right? Your point of budget or priorities. This is really down to a decision maker at a senior level making it happen. And so if that's why average performers are closing out deals, your spider diagram shows us why that's happening because they are miles behind on access to an economic buyer. There's a direct correlation between what you do as part of the deal process and the outcomes you get. And if there's anything that the human brain can do, it's cause and effect, right? And there it is. There's cause and effect right there for you.
Yeah.
The challenge is helping people understand how they bridge that gap. But very first thing is they have to be willing to participate in an activity that says, this is why you're not being successful. And we as leaders have to be good enough in communication, honest enough and authentic enough in getting that across in a way that doesn't crush these poor people because they're probably doing the best they can do. The difference between a low performer and an idiot, right? Someone that's not really fit for your company, is like a bit of a pain in the bum, is huge. And my sense of the world, having seen plenty of it, is that actually there's way more people that don't know. And so the people that don't know, they're like sponges for this kind of stuff, right? And so that's one of the reasons I love this report is that it's a great opportunity for all that stuff, all that experience I've got and all the things that I can talk to, people that I could bring in to talk about the same things. Actually, this is great because it's data, right? And I was talking to someone the other day, and this is my golden nugget of all golden nuggets in your report, right? You are 324% more likely to win a deal. 324%. That's mind-blowing.
Significant.
Yeah, that's an understatement. 324% more likely to win a deal if MEDPIC is completed by solution presented stage. Right? So by the time you put the proposal down, if you've got all that MEDPIC stuff, you are 324% more likely to win a deal. I don't know anything else that's that effective. I'm really struggling. There is no tech stack. There's no bit of software. There's no outbounding sequence that's going to make that kind of difference. And that is entirely in our control. And as I get older, sorry, I keep going about age, I don't know why. As I get older, probably because I'm looking at you, Lee. As I get older, the more I realize all I can affect is what is in my control, right? And that is entirely in my control, right? Therefore, my ability to get a result is predominantly in my control. And that is incredible. But here's the other bit that's really interesting. This is the sub data that goes with it. It takes up to about 6 meetings and about 5 contacts to get to 80% of MEDPIC, right? You're never going to get to 100%. It's not a point. It's not a win or lose, right?
Yeah.
It's about quality. Like, have you got the depth of that deal? So it's going to take you 6 meetings. You've got to speak to more than 5 people. But if you do it by solution presented stage, your chances of winning go through the roof. That just feels like someone's told me how magic works. Do you know what I mean? I feel like if you can't get on board with that, what are you waiting for? What kind of information could possibly compel you more to behave in a professional fashion?
And what's so interesting to me, and exactly why I actually, wanted to have this conversation, is because you're right in the sense of that's it. Like, that's the magic number. That's what I've got to get to. And I think when I look at it and I question it, and I was like, well, how do I do that? If I'm an average performer, I'm usually at like maybe 80% of my quota. I'm a little bit below the waterline. How do I get to the point of having it filled out? Now, I could technically try and cheat it, right? And just fill a little bit of something in. But that's actually not the point that the data talks about. It's effective use of it. And to me, what that all comes back to is like doing effective discovery on those calls. And then all of a sudden I'm rolling all the way back to kind of the art of selling again. And so I guess my question would be, because you kind of touched on it on some of the challenges with coaching, and we were talking about it coming into the conversation today, which is like when you start to boil some of these numbers down, actually what it starts to talk about is really focusing in on many of the things that we already know. For example, high quality discovery. And I know you do lots of coachings. How do you approach plugging those gaps? How do you approach coaching reps and sales teams on some of those more fundamental parts of the sales process?
Yeah. So the first thing is I try and give people a sense of context about what we're trying to achieve. Because if you've got let's say you've got a 120-day sales cycle, because I'm predominantly involved in B2B enterprise sales, right? So 120 is not an unrealistic expectation for a sales. Some are longer, some are shorter, but let's go with 120. I'm constantly trying to shrink that. And everyone goes, oh yeah, it makes sense. But actually what I'm trying to do is get more sales cycles in a year. Therefore I get more innings, if you like, to try and win because I'm getting through more deals. But the way to do that is not to get to a proposal and start selling, which is selling is the bit at the beginning. Everything else is negotiation, which is a different thing, I think. And so really what people do is they compress that bit at the beginning in the hope they can get to a proposal, which they consider the midpoint, right? And then they try and get people to buy it. Actually, what then happens as a result of that is that bit at the end just goes out and it goes beyond 120 days. And based on your report, it drops off a cliff. This is last year's report. It drops off a cliff if you go outside the golden period, right? The conversion rate, because it's unlikely to happen. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but those deals that are like, at 220 days, they're probably not going to happen. Actually, it's counterintuitive for most people. Actually spend longer here. Therefore, when you get to the point where you have presented your solution, actually, you're in a good place because you know who owns the problem, you know what the problem is, you know how they measure improvement, you know the criteria by which they're going to make this decision, and you know the process where you're going to do it. That puts you in an incredible position to then compress the rest of that cycle because you're moving at pace. And I'll give you a really simple thing. One of the things I look out for, because quality stuff is really difficult to do. So you have to find kind of a proxy for it. I'll get back to answer the detail of that question in a sec. One of the things I look out for is how many contacts are associated with that account in certain stages. And the amount of times I look at a pipeline for the first time, I look at every deal. No one ever puts this in the view. So I'd always bring it into the view. And maybe the top 4 deals out of 50 deals have 6 or 7. And then after about 8, it goes to 2 contacts. An entire enterprise company, you have 2 contacts, right? It's terrifying, right? Either you didn't put it in which case you don't get it, right? Because the rest of the company think we can't put them in a sequence, we can't do anything interesting, we can't do the ABM stuff that we want to do, or you don't care and you think you've got it. Even if you've got the economic buy, you still need consensus elsewhere. So that's the first thing, is try and give them the context of what's going on, right? And then the next bit is to try and help them understand what are the key bits that make a difference. When you try and identify the pain, what are you actually looking for? Are you looking for the thing that they tell you or the cause of that thing? So I can tell you my arm hurts. No, actually, I'll do a better one. You go to the doctor, and you say, my head hurts. And they go, oh, it's some aspirin. And you go, oh, thanks. Brilliant. You'd be pretty unhappy, right? And as a CRO, I'm pretty unhappy if that's what's happening. Actually, you will know your job as a seller in that discovery phase is to really understand what is causing that pain. Like, what's behind it? Like, why do you need to do this? Why is this relevant? Why is that thing happening to you? So, it's layers of why to get to that point. So that's the kind of first thing. It's like, give them depth around it. Everyone wants to meet the kind of, I need to be the decision maker. Actually, it's quite offensive to the person you're speaking to say, hey, would you mind if I spoke to the organ grinder because I'm done speaking to the monkey? That's not cool at all. But you do need to speak to the organ grinder, right? How you do that and how you make that work is really, really important. This is where champions become important. So it's getting into the detail of each one of those bits. So now you have context and you've got some detail of like why you need these certain things to be in a structured environment. And then the final bit is technique. Because here is the danger when you learn a new thing, right? Is you go out and you try and use it. And that, by the way, that is what you're supposed to do. But the dangerous bit that comes with it is in this kind of scenario is you're now interrogating a poor person at the end of a Zoom call and saying, what about this? What about that? What do you think about that? What about this? Who's that? Who's this? This is where the 5.6 calls bit comes into play. You're not going to get it in one go. I'll give you an example. I could go on about this forever, but I'll give you one example of something I spoke to a rep about the other day.
Yeah, please.
He said, how do I get to understand, how do I get to meet other people without annoying the person I'm speaking to? Because I know that they're not the person that makes the decision. And I said, I want you to try this. We have found that when we are successful in helping companies and they implement our software, these are the people that are involved. All right. So how can you help me engage those people so that we could deliver this thing for you and we can work together towards that? And he looked kind of dubious at me because it sounds a bit like someone's hurt my feelings. I've been triggered. And that's how someone would speak to me, right? But actually, it's very sensitive. It's authentic. It is respectful. And what you're saying to them is true. You're saying, oh, I think I can help you, but it ain't going to happen unless these people are involved. Because I know that from experience. And so the notion that it is that you're not, that you're a gatekeeper, oh yeah, she's a gatekeeper or he's a gatekeeper, you're totally speaking to the wrong person, right? Not only are you speaking to the wrong person, you may well be speaking to the wrong company. And at that point, you have nothing to lose. I told a story when the guy told me, so this is what I mean by technique. So that's all the experience that I can imbue. The largest deal I ever did, we ended up building a data center off the back of it, is we took a load of servers that were being outsourced, managed, like big mid-range servers out of IBM, and built a data center around it. And the lead that I got was for a £7,000 piece of software. And I'm not a genius. I was a good sales rep. I'm a better sales leader than I was a sales rep. I'll give you the example as a strategy. And I was pretty brash. And I don't recommend this direct approach, but the ethos is similar. And the person I was dealing with said, I need you to quote for this software. It's automation software. And I said, why? And he said, well, we need a price for it. And I went, well, that's not a very good reason for me to price it. You give me the reason for it. And he said, well, look, and it became apparent as we went back, he had no idea why he was being asked to price it. And I said, well, look, I'm really happy to price it. I do need to speak to someone that can tell me what this is about. And he said, well, I'm not going to get a price from you. And I went, that's really by me, because I make £64 in commission off this bit of software. So I'm okay with it. That's the bit I wouldn't recommend. But what then happened was I pushed him and I said, look, but we are the leading bit of software. So you're going to look a bit silly if you don't include us. Anyway, long story short, I ended up speaking to the IT director. And here's what happened. He had an outsourcing agreement with IBM. They continued to charge him extra for all these little jobs. And he was trying to buy automation software to fix the problem so he could automate these little jobs. But that wasn't his pain. That was the symptom of the pain. That was the headache. His pain was he had an outsourcing agreement with no fixed cost. So it sort of defeated the objective of his outsourcing agreement. And so ultimately what we did is we gave him a solution to that. That was the best deal I've ever done. And it was years ago. But it's a really good example of pain versus symptom. Because actually this 6,000 bit of software and millions of pounds worth of outsourcing deal for multiple years, I could easily have chucked a price out and just missed the boat. And it's that kind of thing that you need to imbue to people. And like, how the hell are they going to learn that? Where do they get that from? That's the bit that I struggle with. Is I think this is kind of like paucity of training that happens. It's like, maybe I should set up a business doing this, but it's this kind of idea that actually, how do people even know that this is a thing that they could do? Because if someone says to you, oh, this is our problem, you kind of take it at face value. But I think the quality of a great rep is they're inquisitive and they're interested and they want to know a bit more. And it's not like a interrogation. They're like, oh, well, that's interesting. Why is that? It's that kind of inquisitiveness that I think makes great reps.
It's such a great point, and particularly around the challenge of getting reps to, I guess, see it in that way, as you say. And I asked quite a few people, what are the kind of traits that you're looking for when you're hiring great reps? And curiosity is like always number one. But because for that reason, I mean, technically, you don't even have to train it if you just get someone that's naturally the type of person that enjoys asking questions and can be a little bit nosy, right?
Just tune them with technique, don't you? So they doesn't sound like an interrogation, right? But they go for it.
Exactly. And there is a fine line between the two. And to be honest, this was the kind of question I was asking myself, even when creating the report, which is the natural question to all of these is, okay, this is what my top performers are doing. This is what my average performers are doing. How do we close the gap between the two? And obviously I come at this from the technology perspective, and how do we potentially do that? And it's a difficult one to answer because there's no other than like technologically, I guess, trying to clone people, but we're a little bit of a way off that.
I thought you went a different technology way.
We're not there today. However, and internally, we're working on a few different things to try and understand, well, how do we start to bridge that gap? But ultimately, I don't think that, and time might prove me wrong on this, I don't think ultimately technology will be able to answer that question that you kind of talk about, because how I see it, so much of that gap is often experience that gets the top performer to where they are, because it is a combination of the traits and their character, but also the experience of having done many of those calls and meetings before, going through that process many times, knowing the type of questions that they should ask, knowing the type of things that they should draw on to then start to dig further. And that's, I guess, why we're starting to look at it is, well, we can't necessarily teach them what those questions are, but we can highlight those instances so that when they are being coached, although as you kind of talked about, how frequently are they being coached, but at least making those insights available of, this objection was mentioned at this stage and we didn't have a particularly good answer for it. Being able to drill into those moments rather than, I think the challenge around coaching and training at the minute, certainly when you look at specific examples, is it relies on a human being to go and look through all of those calls, and you're then also relying on human nature to pick out those key bits to then go and coach someone. I think that's inherently one of the challenges where, particularly when you've got a large sales team, that's many hours of calls that and however many emails to go and trawl through to really understand what exactly should I be coaching them on.
Yeah. So we're now out of sales and into management, right? Well, leadership, I would call it. Management is getting things done. Leadership is doing the right things.
Yeah.
It's a great Drucker quote. Bouncing around
I
my
love
head.
That.
Yeah. So here's where it gets interesting. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and about motivation and stuff like that, because it is the heart of leadership. I can't motivate anyone. I think of myself as charismatic and a good leader, and I've got some decent experience and some good stories and stuff. I can't motivate you, really. I can make you excited for a bit. Only you can motivate you, right? My job is to figure out the thing that actually motivates you and help you understand the different ways, and it is different for everyone, that you can get what it is that motivates you from doing the thing that we do together at work. Right? That's the best I can do. And that is almost never done. Right? Like almost never. Like in my experience with leaders, they just want me to get the job done. A very small number have correlated that to what I want to get to, what matters to me, and figuring out how to connect those things. Because if I've learned anything about people, I've learned two things about people in my entire life. One, you can't make anyone do anything. And I have children, I freaking try. You can't make anyone do anything.
Yeah.
Right? Two, people will do anything to do what they want. Right? They'll break the law, they'll cheat, lie, whatever it is, or they'll do great things. Right? More frequently, they'll do great things to do what they want. So how the hell do you combine those two pieces of information to get the result you want? So that's the kind of first bit, is you've got to create an environment where people take responsibility for their own success. It's not easy. It's not, and it is not entirely your responsibility. The bit that is your responsibility as a leader is to create that environment such that people understand it is their responsibility. And I was speaking to a rep the other day, and I said, look, you have to take responsibility for the fact that deal is slipping. You can blame the customer if you want, but just so you're clear, you didn't ask them to give you any feedback after the proposal, and they are not contacting you. And that is their normal behavior. And you would have known that had you asked. Or you would have had a mechanism, you would have had something to go. So there's a little example, but it's that kind of like, take responsibility for what you do. That's the first bit. The second bit then is that if you've got the right people and they have the curiosity, is to give them a pathway to where they need to get to. And one of the reasons I love your report is because it's a great way of sitting down with someone and go, look, this is what good looks like. Where are you on this continuum? What are you going to do about it? What do you need? The correlation between success and people in the team helping each other is like it's 100%. Every great team, and I've built a small number of great teams and lots of good teams, but every great team I have built for different reasons has found a way of helping each other. And so this notion of how do you decide what the right things are? Well, you can't, because there's just not, I've run teams of hundreds of people, right? You just cannot get to everyone. They have to serve themselves. They have to help each other. They have to do it a mite closer to where they are, where they might sit, the people around them, their peers. That has to happen there. Your job is to create that environment. And it's really difficult to do because it's the bit that everyone calls soft skills. But I think that's not soft at all. I think that's leadership. And that's the bit that I think as leaders, it's too easy not to do and just sort of stand and point and go, we're going over there, everybody. This kind of like macho, hierarchical, male-orientated view of leadership, right? It just like, it's 2024, guys.
I think it's a different type of leader. I mean, I would concur because I feel like I'm cut from a similar cloth. But what you're kind of referring to is you're very much the stereotypical type of leader that you expect. Charismatic, inspirational, geeing everyone up with these magnificent speeches. What stood out to me as you were kind of talking through it was really two things. One is that not being able to motivate people. I suppose that's why on every job description it asks everyone to be a self-starter, right? In the sense of but second to that, just to draw back on something you mentioned earlier, it's focusing on what you can control rather than not on what you can't necessarily. So rather than trying to control people and like constantly trying to tell people what to do, I can certainly say from experience, it's immensely draining as a leader to having to be constantly trying to manage people. And it kind of amazes me that so many leaders lean into micromanagement. I think I did it for all of about 2 weeks and I was just exhausted by the end of it. But also the things that you can control are understanding it's the strengths and weaknesses of the people in your team and playing to those strengths. And I think that in quite a few of the conversations I've been having recently has come up quite a lot, where oftentimes, particularly when you're in maybe a scaling business or you're trying to go into like more of a sustainability phase, it's all about, we've got process, everyone follow the process, and we're going to get this repeatable revenue out the other end. And you essentially create this blueprint that you're trying to force people into. And it actually, I think this came up in my conversation with Andy Paul a little while back, where it's you're all of a sudden treating people like a cog in a machine and forgetting that they are a human being. It's funny how we all start to come everything just seems to go in cycles, and we're back here again where it's like, oh yeah, they're actually people. And oh, if I just understood the kind of things that motivate them, then that's what and then we lean into that, and that's what motivates. And it's like, wow, we were talking about this kind of pre-show that like the amount of things that you forget. Was it like
big this forgetfulness curve? That was probably sport it. Which is you forget half of what you learn within an hour and then the same half every hour unless you use it.
Forgetting about that as well. John, I feel like we could probably chew the fat for another hour. I want to ask you one final very quick question. What is one book that you'd recommend to other revenue leaders?
I think revenue leaders should read The Challenger Sale. Not because you should all adopt The Challenger Sale, right? That's not the reason. Because that is another book that talks about top performers in downturn markets and the distinction between them. And it talks a lot about what getting to the nub of the problem. And what I like about it is that we got very we got into a mode which was, hey, we've discovered that solutions are the answer, right? This is probably before your time. And so you sit down, it's almost like you got a pipe and go, hey, so tell me about your problems. And the customers, they're like, well, I've got to tell everyone what my problems are, which is sort of what SaaS is about, because it solves a problem. I can solve this problem. The challenge is you can no longer ask those questions anymore because you can only solve one thing. And the whole point of SaaS is a shared service, right? So you can't make a thing for them. So the old way of selling is, what's your problem? You come back into the business and then we make a solution from all the bits we've got and some services and we deliver it back, right? That's not how SaaS works. You can solve one problem. If you're lucky, two, right? You can pretend you can solve more, but it's really one or two things. So what this does really well is talk about that motion that says, this is how you punch the hole. This is how this works. So all the things that we've talked about, they all exist within it. But actually, it's the way that they do it that I think is really powerful, that says, this is a thing that you have to do to improve your business now. Whether you do that with us or not, you still have to improve it. And I think that's incredibly powerful.
I love that. Great recommendation. All right. We've covered a lot of ground today and referenced quite a lot of things and many different data points. I will make sure that they are included in the show notes of this episode, wherever anyone's listening. John, I know I actually found you from your own website, but for anyone listening, where can they reach out to you with any questions or get more of your opinions?
Well, if you're interested in more opinions, I have no end of them, but you can find me on the notsosecretcro.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm really happy to talk to anyone on LinkedIn. And it's all linked all through there on my page as well. So if that's where you want to find me, that's where I am.
Brilliant. We'll add all that into the show notes as well.
Brilliant.
John,
thank you, Lee.
Thank you so much.
Been fun. Cheers, mate. Bye.